On December 16th, 2021, after an over 2-year wait and several delays, Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach finally released. It had been the most highly anticipated FNAF game ever, with a scope far broader than anything that had come before, and as the release date kept getting pushed back, expectations continued to mount. With all this in mind, the FNAF community, and honestly the internet at large, were incredibly excited to see what this new chapter of the series had in store. And the release was a total hot mess. Almost everything was wrong with Security Breach at launch. Game-breaking bugs that could easily soft-lock your playthrough, disastrous performance issues that made the game strain on even the beefiest PCs, Godspeed if you want to play on a laptop, and non-streamlined and obscure gameplay, the frustration of which was compounded by the aforementioned brokenness of the game. What was initially most offensive for me, though, and many others, was the story. Because Scott Cawthon didn't tell the people making his game what game they were supposed to be making, it was ostensibly an incoherent, half-baked mess. It seemed as if, rather than letting the new characters shine, the Afton art characters had been shoehorned back into the story, most indicative of this problem being the return of Old Man Afton in the basement, an ending it seems like Scott and Steel will now want us to forget ever happened. Suffice it to say, the FNAF community, and also people who weren't even really FNAF fans anymore, were incensed by this flop, and in response, one of the most common refrains you'd hear was, FNAF should have ended a pizzeria simulator. It's been 3 years? That can't be right. Oh my god. Okay, sorry. It's been 3 years since Security Breach's release, and since then the vitriol surrounding it has simmered down much more. A series of patches has smoothed over a lot of the rougher edges of the game, and generally it doesn't threaten to blow up your computer when you play it anymore. Moreover, we've gotten a lot more clarification on the story and what this game is actually about, thanks to the Ruin DLC and the Tales from the Pizzaplex books, and it feels much less like it's desperately cloying at nostalgia. As it happens, telling the people making your game what the game is about is a good way for the story to make sense to the audience. Go figure. Still, though, that aforementioned refrain is something you hear relatively often, and I just want to add that it's usually from people who aren't even really involved in the fandom anymore, but still call themselves OG fans. Nevertheless, it still is something that I see an annoying amount, so today I'm here to dispel this honestly stupid and bad idea. I should preface this by saying that once upon a time, Pizzeria Simulator was also one of the top rankers on my FNAF tier list. I think for a long time I was blindsided by the sheer excitement of the release, which I will say was incredibly hype. I had no spoilers at all going in, so I figured it would just be a cute, quick intermission game, but I will never forget seeing that Scrap Baby cutscene for the first time. Aside from that, I was also blinded by frankly the sheer epicness of the finale, which I have plenty of problems with, which we'll get to, but I will say there is a good reason it's become such a meme outside of FNAF. The prose itself is just stunning. However, in the past few years, I've thought a lot more about the writing of FNAF, in both ways that I think are underappreciated, see Fandom Follies, but also ways that it fell flat. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've realized that Pizzeria Simulator is kind of an incomplete mess of a story. It started with Scrap Baby, who I thought I hated for a while, but then I realized that it's not really her fault. She's not the cause, she's just a symptom of the greater writing sickness ailing this game. And I'm just gonna say right now, I don't want to hear jack shit about tales from Security Breach haters who also praise Pizzeria Simulator to the high heavens, but we'll get there. So join me, FNAF fans and non-FNAF fans alike, on this journey. Despite all its praise and iconic moments, when you pull back all the flowery language that Pizzeria Simulator is dressed up in, hopefully you'll come to realize that these ostensibly epic moments ring kind of hollow when this game sits on a half-baked, incomplete foundation. That is all to say that no, actually, FNAF 6 would not be the perfect finale. Part 1. Gameplay. Bad. Okay, I'm exaggerating. Not all of Pizzeria Simulator's gameplay is bad, and in fact there's quite a few parts of it that are some of my personal favorite gameplay sections in FNAF overall. So let's start with the good and work our way down. The tycoon parts of Pizzeria Simulator, for example, are really enjoyable, and that actually gives it a lot of replay value, which, despite my constant praise of it, is one of Sister Location's few weaknesses. I will never stop resenting Scott for never giving us endless tycoon mode and instead leaving us with this ceaseless Andrew discourse. Give me more content of Helby breaking his back. Why wasn't the man in room 1280 about Helby being in the hospital after breaking his back however many times? I love The Sims, I love project management games, so this is right up my alley. I do wish there was a bit more creative liberty in terms of the floor plan, but I get why it's not super robust, because it's not technically the core of the game. Moreover, I love all the little secrets in the minigames necessary for the lorekeeper ending. I don't necessarily love all the secrets themselves, but I like that they're there. I find it fun. Seeing Fruity Maze break down the first time was genuinely super eerie. Just the fact that Scott went to the trouble to design all the little test minigames is impressive to me. It adds a whole new layer of depth to this section of the game. So yes, all of this is to say that I love the Tycoon section. It's a lot of fun and gives the game a lot of replay value. But there is something I love even more, and it's the salvage minigames. These are genuinely some of the most disturbing, atmospheric moments in FNAF, rivaling the private room and pizza party. The sickly orange lighting that dimly envelops the animatronic, the quiet hum of the single light bulb, the eerie, discordant audio emitted by the tape recorder, it's also unsettling and anxiety-inducing. This is helped by the fact that the animatronic movements become increasingly subtle as the nights go on, forcing you to lean in really close and look for the slightest differences. In turn, that means that if you don't react in time, you'll get a face full of jump scare, making it all the more effective. It's similar to the Ballora Gallery troll jump scare in Sister Location. Also, this is one of the few times in an afton arc game where an animatronic can attack from an idle position. In FNaF 1 through 3, most attacks were bound by you triggering the game to register a movement, like flipping up the camera, and in Sister Location and 4, they just lunge out of the darkness or force you into the animation. While that can be startling, seeing something actively move in these games is such a rarity that whenever it happens, it catches you so off guard, especially when you probably don't even realize that something is wrong and you're about to die. So we have 2 home runs, but then you get to the office segment and it's like, what went wrong here? So as a concept, I actually don't hate the idea. The idea of having to complete a linear set of tasks instead of just surviving for an allotted period of time is good, because it kind of forces you to take action. In the first few games, when you're down to the hour and you have enough resources left, you can just go into lockdown mode, but in Pizzeria Simulator, the game will not end until you end it yourself, which is actually quite thematically appropriate. However, the tasks themselves are hardly very gripping. It boils down to click button and look at vent while you wait. Unlike something like the break room minigame from Sister Location, where you have a bespoke task with a visible threat, the tension just is non-existent here. Even something like the animatronic maintenance minigames from Help Wanted would have been more interesting because, again, it actively engages you in the task. You don't even have to be looking at the screen for Pizzeria Simulator's tasks to work, unlike with Sister Location where you have to be locked in and pressing the button. Speaking of visible threats, that's another problem I have with the Office gameplay. You just barely get to see the animatronics at all, which is such a shame considering how damn cool they all look in the salvage minigame lighting. It even saves Scrap Trap, kind of. You'd be hard-pressed to salvage that, pun intended. Some people might be arguing right now, but that's also a thing in FNaF 4, to which I tell you, yes, that's also a problem I have with that game, but at least the excuse there is that it makes no sense to have cameras in a house. Why wouldn't there be cameras in this place when every other Fazbear location has been decked out with them? Aside from that, in FNaF 4, there's at least more depth to the animatronics we do see, like the flashes of them disappearing down the hall, the Foxy Closet Challenge, and the jump scares, which I want to talk about a little. Look, I don't want to go in too hard on Scott because I know he had memory restrictions working against him, but coming off of FNaF 4 and Sister Location with some of the rawest jump scare animations of the series, these are just so lame. Like, look at Scrap Babies, she just kind of drops in, like, hey there. My last thing for this section is that the meta is just far too predictable. Yes, every afton arc game has a pretty straightforward meta, and it's usually just the only option available to really win, but at least there's some elements of unpredictability in them. For example, losing track of Springtrap in FNaF 3 for even a little bit can be really disorienting, especially when you're busy having to reset the failing systems. It's not an insultingly arbitrary mechanic, but it's disorienting enough to be stressful. UCN even really masters this. When Dee appears, most of the time people don't even die to the new thing she summoned. They get too disoriented trying to find whoever she added to remember to deal with everything else going on. Again, it's not an element of randomness that's just a totally unavoidable death sentence. To an extent, it is good to have predictable mechanics. You don't want the game to just completely pull the rug out from under you and for things not to work. But in survival horror, I feel that an element of randomness is necessary for scariness. In Pizzeria Simulator, you can just drop the audio lure in either bottom corner and generally be good to go, give or take some vent disabilities. And I think that this is another disadvantage of the lack of cameras. The lack of a visible threat and the consistent meta just completely destroys any potential suspense. In my last playthrough of the completion ending, I actually managed to clear the game without any deaths at all. I don't know if I'm just really good or if the meta is just way too reliable. Also, silent ventilation is completely useless. Part 2. Story. Bad. Okay, so Pizzeria Simulator's gameplay leaves something to be desired, clearly. However, that's not the end of the world. People have argued this for basically every FNaF game there is, but that ultimately isn't too big a deal. I think it's fair to say that the majority of us aren't playing FNaF mostly for the thrilling gameplay, we're here for the story. I'm not exactly an expert in the area of good gameplay, but I'm also not exactly a writing expert. However, I do know a thing or two more about it than I do about gameplay, though, so this is what I take more issue with. First, let's just do a quick story rundown. I assume you all know the story of Pizzeria Simulator by now, but I just want to lay it out so I can pick it apart more anally. So, Henry Emily, the creator of the original animatronics, sees the bloody legacy Fazbear has left behind and realizes he needs to put an end to all of this violence once and for all. In order to do this, he devises a plan. He will create a new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, but this isn't just any old pizzeria. Behind the dining area is an elaborate labyrinth of corridors and vents laden with sounds and smells designed to keep the animatronics chasing their tails. Michael Afton is hired as the manager for this restaurant, and over the course of 1 week, he salvages Molten Freddy, Ennard, Springtrap, William Afton, Scrap Baby, Elizabeth, and Lefty, the puppet. All of this concludes with Henry lighting the place on fire to nullify the remnant, tethering their spirits to their animatronic bodies, thus ending the Afton arc and the bloody legacy of the Afton and Emily families. Alright, so that's fine enough as a concept. All these loose threads are tied up in a neat little bow and we can all go home. Except not really, because this story pulls a lot out of its ass to make itself work. First of all, Henry. I do not want to hear a peep out of anyone who complains about Edwin coming out of the left field praise Pizzeria Simulator in the same breath. I'm gonna be so very real with you all. Henry's existence for this game only is such a deus ex machina. William was introduced in Sister Location, but not with nearly the same level of baggage associated with Henry. For all intents and purposes, in that game he was just putting a name to the face of Purple Guy. Yes, you could read the Silver Eyes for additional characterization and context, but it's not required reading. Aside from this, Purple Guy had been a thing since FNaF 2. Henry had not been a thing since FNaF 2, and yet he is central to this game's story and the ending of this arc altogether. I'm gonna level with you here. I don't dislike Henry's introduction to the games. I'm mostly going in this hard because I'm so sick of people bitching about Edwin when he's getting an entire game's worth of introduction. What I do dislike is that Henry exists in the games just so he can magically appear to resolve everything with his batshit insane plan. Speaking of batshit insane plan, I'm not criticizing the writing for Henry's plan being batshit insane. Based on Henry's behavior in the novel trilogy, it's actually very consistent with his character to concoct a plan this convoluted and extra. Like, this is the same man who committed suicide via robot with giant sword and also tried to blow a little girl up, so I wouldn't put it past him. However, I will criticize the writing for this all working. In the novel trilogy, Henry had insane ideas and plans, and they generally blew up in his face, because of course they did. So let's just go over all the contrivances requiring this to work. 1. The summons. We don't even really know the nature of this call. How did this work? Did he just send out like a radio ad? Maybe the assumption is that the presence of Freddy's is just some kind of irresistible instinct held by the animatronics, but 1, why? 2, that should have been explained then, and 3, that's not really a call, that's just them coming of their own volition. And we know that it was a specific action since Baby says that she heard his call. Anyway, that aside, the plan assumes all the animatronics will even answer the summons to begin with, and miraculously they do. Lefty and Molten Freddy I have no complaints about. Lefty was explicitly designed to retrieve the puppet, so of course it makes sense that he'd come back. And it seems like Molten Freddy is acting off some kind of animalistic instinct, so yes, that's fine. But William and Baby confuse me because they're clearly more intelligent than their counterparts. William says that he knew the call was a lie as soon as he heard it, and yet he came anyway. And yes, I could totally buy the idea of William taking the bait and then bluffing by saying this was totally part of his evil plan all along. Very in character for him. But why bring it up at all if you're not gonna do anything with it? Baby, meanwhile, implies in her line after successfully salvaging her that she knows who Henry is.
You don't really know who your employer is, do you?
Which feels very out of left field. Again, why did she come? It feels like this plot thread in general is in need of more explanation. What exactly is Henry's relationship to Baby in the games? If it's the same as the fourth closet, that's kind of weird because she looks like a giant toddler as opposed to an appropriately sized young woman. And there's also nothing besides that one line, and maybe the insanity ending if you want to interpret it that way, that implies the connection. And again, if she knew this was Henry and we're assuming that they have some kind of pre-existing beef, why would she come? Using the novel trilogy as a point of reference, Baby hates Henry in that book because he treated her horribly. He locked her in a closet and told Aunt Jen to blow her up. And she's also not stupid. In Sister Location and in the fourth closet, where she actively embodies Marv Elizabeth, she's very intelligent. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get back to that later. It just feels antithetical to the idea of Henry doing too little too late and the consistent theme of his bonkers ideas blowing up in his face for all these elements to fall into place so neatly. This shouldn't just go off without a hitch. And it seems like Scott realized that, which is why UCN and Stitchline are a thing, but we're getting there eventually. Let's talk about Michael now. Michael's writing in general is kind of weird, and I talked about it a bit in my Vanessa video, but in Sister Location, Scott decided to make him a major through line through the overarching story of the Afton arc. Moreover, Michael started to develop a sense of a character arc in this game. The general idea is presumably that after accidentally causing his brother's untimely demise, he decided he's going to break the cycle of abuse and go to Freddy's to trace and hopefully rectify his father's crimes. At the very least, post-Sister Location, he wants to track down William and get answers out of him. That's a pretty strong concept for an arc being added this late in the game, and I think Scott did a good job at weaving it in retroactively. But what's weird is that after writing this in, the next game, which is chronologically a sequel, and the finale of this arc, just seems to forget to write him. And look, that's not to say Michael has the most rich characterization of the first 5 games, but that's also because Scott didn't know what he was doing at that point. By Sister Location, Scott was acutely aware that people were invested in this as a story, which is, in my opinion, one of the major strengths of that game. So why didn't he carry it over to this? When we were on game 6 out of 6, the "he didn't know he was making a sequel" excuse doesn't fly anymore. In Pizzeria Simulator, Michael's arc seems totally stripped of agency. He's just going along with Henry's batshit plan like a big dumb baby, and then Henry just immolates him at the end without him seemingly having an opinion about all this. It doesn't seem like he has any stake in this anymore, he's just kinda here for the ride. And again, this is not untrue of Sister Location either, where he's just going along with William's orders, but that works for that game because it ties into the theme of wanting approval from his father. We're at the final chapter here, where Michael has presumably transcended his desire for acceptance or redemption, become an actualized person. His character should be more articulate here. The most we get of him is the court documents, which you're statistically unlikely to see and are not part of the main plot. And again, I'm sorry I can't help myself, but I have to compare it to Sister Location. Even if Michael has no active speaking role, that game does so much at establishing little details that contribute to his characterization. The angsty teen gag on night 2, the immortal and the restless, him not moving when he scooped, the final monologue. All of these seemingly benign details, when taken in concert with FNaF 4, build a pretty strong picture of the type of person that Michael is. Speaking of which, let's talk more about the Afton clan, because honestly the whole family's a mess here in terms of writing. Let's start with Baby. Oh boy. I'm not gonna get too deep into her here since I've already made an extended analysis of Baby and Elizabeth, but she's one of the greatest victims of this game's writing. So, in Sister Location, Baby does not like William. For more about this, again, go watch my Elizabeth video, but based on Night 4, the Hanging Technicians, Michael's final soliloquy, it's pretty easy to conclude that Elizabeth's influence drives Baby to resent William, thanks in no small part to the whole trapping her in a basement for an upwards of 10 years thing. Then after this, we have the interim period in which Michael vomits up Ennard, Baby is ejected from the Ennard clan, and she returns to Circus Babies to fashion herself a new body, leading to the existence of Scrap Baby. But for some inexplicable reason, Baby has now adopted 2 traits. One, she seems to think that she is Elizabeth, or they've become a merged consciousness, kind of like the Fourth Closet, hence her referring to William as her father. 2, she just seems to wholeheartedly love William in this one, in a completely uncomplicated way. I want to compare this to her portrayal in the Fourth Closet. In the Fourth Closet, Elizabeth is also William's arm, but she's portrayed in a much more nuanced way. She fundamentally knows that William doesn't really value her beyond her utility, but she also naturally wants him to love her, which is why she still sticks by him despite his poor treatment of her. It's a very complex portrayal, one that is accurate to the complicated relationships people often have with their abusers in real life. In Pizzeria Simulator, there seems to be no such nuance. Of the little dialogue we get, Baby/Elizabeth seems to have fully embraced her murderous nature, enthusiastically at that.
Now we can do what we were created to do, and be complete. I will make you proud, Daddy.
So what changed here? Why did Baby go from wanting William dead, and to spite him specifically, to wanting to please him and join him in his murderous merriment? I don't hate this development on its own, I just hate that it's not justified at all. We'll get back to Baby in the Fourth Closet later, trust. What about William? Well, he's also pretty weird and inconsistent. In FNaF 3, I thought Springtrap was pretty clearly portrayed as a punishment. It's like Icarus flying too close to the sun. He taunts the ghost kids and that ends up being his downfall. Also, these noises and imagery like this do not to me indicate a man who's super enthusiastic about being in there. But then in Pizzeria Simulator, he's happy about it for, again, an undisclosed reason. Again, like with Baby, I want to know what changed between FNaF 3 and now. It hasn't even been that long. On top of this, at least with Baby, her sudden change can be ascribed to some nebulous scrambling of parts during her transition from Ennard to Scrap Baby. William seems to have switched shells as well, which is why he looks like that. But Baby is partially the robot's AI. Springtrap and Scraptrap are both entirely William, aside from the inherent attraction to the audio lures. What could have gotten lost in the sauce here? Something I find really funny is that whenever this is brought up, there's one camp that's he always enjoyed being Springtrap, stupid, and then there's another camp that's he's clearly just bluffing, stupid, and either side always says it with complete confidence, and I'm like, okay, maybe this wasn't articulated very well in the game. That's kind of the thing with the FNaF fandom. As much as I hate the excess negativity and the people who act like they're too good for FNaF, what's equally annoying is the toxic positivity where you can't make any critiques of the writing, and oftentimes people's rebuttals to arguments about the writing being bad are just, actually the writing is good because of this supposition I made apropos of little to nothing. And headcanons and AUs are fine, they're great in fact, I love them, but they're not substitutes for actual writing on Scott's part. Anyway, digression over. So the Aftons are struggling here in the writing department, and you have to suppose a lot for their characters to make sense, and they kind of fall apart as soon as you give it some thought. Which leads me into Part 3. You need to buy book DLC to understand a lot of plot points in this game. So ultimately, this is what this has all been leading to. You've been fooled. We've all been fooled. This whole game is just an ad for the novel trilogy. Okay, not really, I'm being dramatic, but still, my point. So much of this game feels like it assumes that you will have read the novel trilogy, or pulls its plot points from the fourth closet without really doing any legwork to justify their existence in game canon. For example, something I've been prattling on about this whole video, Baby. I've made no bones about how deeply I love Elizabeth's character in the fourth closet, and how much I appreciate the nuances in her relationship with William, and how that nuance is lost in Pizzeria Simulator, and it really feels like that's a product of this plot thread being transposed onto the game devoid of context. The fourth closet actually gives a reason for Elizabeth to be William's ally. After she was killed by Baby and Henry locked her in the closet, she escaped at the end of the Twisted Ones and reunited with him. Moreover, we see these childhood flashbacks in the book that show her desperately trying to win her father's love. The scene where she steals her teacher's makeup to make herself look like Baby is one of my favorite scenes in any FNaF media ever. It's so tragic. She only goes back to William because she has nowhere else to turn to, and it's only natural for a little girl to want her father's love, especially when she's never known love from anyone else. However, such is not the case in Sister Location. For one, in the fourth closet, as I've said, Baby and Elizabeth are as one. She has the memories of both the robot and the child. For another, Baby hates William in Sister Location. These two are both great characters, but they're not at all interchangeable. Scott just took TFC Elizabeth, dropped her into the story of the games in which none of those events happened, and as a result, her arc is confusing and bad. It really seemed like he wanted to intertwine these stories more deeply, but he wrote himself into a corner with Sister Location, and instead of trying to rectify that in the game story, he just walked over the paint. It's the writing equivalent of trying to put the square peg into the round hole. This aside, there's just a lot of stuff you need the fourth closet to properly understand in Pizzeria Simulator. 1. Charlie and Henry existing. As I said already, Henry's existence is such a deus ex machina, and comparing it to Sister Location, William's introduction asks a lot less of you. The same goes for Charlie, because that makes this even weirder if you don't know who this man is, and now he's spending a large portion of his dramatic finale talking about his daughter as if you should know who she is. It's fine to have Easter eggs and references for those who have read the books, but she occupies a large part of the real estate of Henry's finale monologue. If you don't know who she is, then it really undercuts the emotional impact of that moment. Then there's Remnant. A few years ago, I replied to some comment on my fourth closet review where I expressed my opinion on Remnant. I don't really believe this anymore, most ghost stories have ectoplasm or whatever, but I think its introduction to gameline was weird and bad, and I think that's why I believed it. The fourth closet gives a pretty clear explanation for what Remnant is. When haunted metal is melted down, you can acquire the essence of the soul in liquid form. But in Pizzeria Simulator, all we get is a lot of it is in Molten Freddy, and it's nullified with heat. Actually, I just remember that the Molten Freddy blueprint was cut, so we didn't even get that. In my opinion, that actually would have made a pretty big difference, because we could then at least suppose that Remnant is ghost something, but alas. And yes, Remnant is not critical to understanding the plot of this game, but it's a thread that just goes unexplained. What's even dumber is that unlike Charlie, who at least existed before this game, Remnant didn't get a proper explanation until the fourth closet came out in July. Scott really just wrote this story and was like, you'll have a complete understanding of the events of this game in 7 months. This game is supposedly free, but it's really $8.58 plus tax and shipping. And finally, we have the pièce de résistance of this disaster. Perhaps my least favorite plot point in all of FNaF, Molten MCI. If you're unfamiliar, Molten MCI is the theory, well, I say theory, it's pretty much a fact at this point, that the remnant of the classics was gathered and used as fuel for the fun times, which is what the Insanity ending is presumed to refer to. That's also the retroactive explanation for whatever's going on in the Follow Me minigames. So, I don't hate this concept. The idea of the missing children's spirits being appropriated to kill in the same way they were killed is a sickening thing for William to do, and it's tragically ironic. That's one thing I wish we got more of in FNaF, the horror of being unable to control your own body. And as with most things in the game that come from the trilogy, in the fourth closet, I think it was done pretty well. The existence of circus babies in that book at all is still iffy to me, like I just don't get the point of it, but it provided a nice emotional resolution to that story arc and gave Carlton a strong narrative through line. But in the games it's just, God, it's so stupid! It messes up Sister Location's timeline placement for one, which makes Michael's arc weird and confusing, and it also completely undermines FNaF 3, something this game did a lot of already. I know it's a very basic opinion, but sometimes things are basic because they're true. FNaF 3's good ending is one of the most poignant moments in the entire franchise. The constant pushback of the happiest day strips this moment entirely of its emotional punch, and while yes, the cemetery scene at the end of the Lore Keeper ending is similarly poignant, it just doesn't quite hit the same the second time around. Also, in my opinion, there's no beating Don't Go. It's just such an iconic song. The quiet serenity of nature is nice, but it doesn't pack the same emotional punch. Another thing that's stupid that I don't like about Molten MCI, as in it's a stupid reason, but I'll say it nonetheless, is that I don't like the idea of a child being in Ballora. Like, I don't know, the idea of a little kid being this sexy lady robot just weirds me out, but that's neither here nor there. As I said that, I just realized that Ballora is the only fun time absent in the novel trilogy, so it's so, again, this just goes back to my point. Like, he's just pulling things without actually doing the legwork to justify them. So, there. In conclusion, this is the thing I hate the most that's pulled from the fourth closet and stripped of all context. I can put aside the weird Elizabeth stuff, the weird Henry stuff, the remnant stuff. This is really the most offensive thing to come out of this. An entire game is rendered completely pointless in the story, all because Scott wanted to have his cake and eat it too and didn't plan out his story well, just so we could get a lame rehash of the same thing but done worse. Oh, and speaking of completely pointless, Part 4. All of this is a wash because of UCN and Stitchline. So, despite all its problems, at least Pizzeria Simulator tied up the Afton arc nicely and concluded these characters' stories, right? It may have gotten there kicking and screaming, but at least across the finish line, right? Right? The one strongest point this game has going for it, the incredibly impactful finale and the footprint it left, is completely undercut by the succeeding mainline FNaF stories. First of all, UCN. Okay, so on its own, I actually don't dislike the premise of UCN, and I thought it was actually fine before Frights. The idea of a lingering spirit so consumed by anger that they keep William around explicitly to torture him is good. It's a decent epilogue that nicely ties into the themes of revenge and cyclical trauma that were established by the Afton arc. Also, side note, but there's this thing I see on Twitter a lot where people are like, without Stitchline, the story of UCN would never be settled, and it's like, I don't know, not everything needs an explicit explanation. It's fine for things to be left open to interpretation. The ending of UCN provides an ethical dilemma for the audience. Should the vengeful spirit heed the words of Old Man Consequences and leave the demon to his demons, or linger eternally and give William his just deserts? It's an interesting moral quandary to leave the Afton arc on. But then Stitchline had to come along and mess it all up. William and Charlie, whose stories had been wrapped up in Pizzeria Simulator, came back for one epilogue, just one, so both of them could unceremoniously die again. It would be one thing if it was the result of a lack of foresight on Henry's behalf, but it really wasn't. The only reason his plan fell through was because of some completely unpredictable plot element that came totally out of left field. It wasn't some foreseeable thing that was obviously a massive wrench in the plan since the start, like the deal with the Charlie boss in the fourth closet. It's some random child that's been completely unmentioned by the story up until this point. It's like whatever the opposite of Chekhov's gun is. It'd be like if there was a secret hidden gun in a drawer that went completely unmentioned until the 11th hour. This is the kind of stupid contrived stuff that people who don't like FNaF think FNaF is like, and that they make fun of FNaF for it. I can't help but feel like Scott had the same realization that the story of Pizzeria Simulator was weird and bad and tried to retroactively undo it and do it better with Stitchline, but in the end it just messed it all up even more. I remember after the FNaF World mobile port came out, Scott said something to the effect of how eventually we need to stop sugarcoating a turd and start making a cake, and I wish he applied that principle to the ending of the Afton arc. Yes, as much as I dislike Pizzeria Simulator as an ending, I would rather that than this constant backpedaling and wishy-washiness. We don't need constant reminders that Pizzeria Simulator was weird and bad. It'd be one thing to bring William and Charlie back so they could be re-established, but no, they come back for one epilogue just so they can die again. The main villain of Five Nights at Freddy's has his unceremonious death in a single epilogue of a short story collection, and that's the impression we're left with. I'm so glad that the introduction of the Mimic has seemingly put William in his grave for good. So there we have it, Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, a game that, when you look past all its smoke and mirrors and drama, is a game held together by scotch tape and dental floss with a novel and a short story anthology thrown on top in a meager attempt to tie it all together. It's funny, because I used the security breach thing at the start mostly as a framing device for why Pizzeria Simulator received so much praise, but as I wrote this video out, I realized that most of people's problems with security breach, performance notwithstanding, are broadly applicable to Pizzeria Simulator, if not even more so. Muddled and poorly explained plot points over a line on the books, the introduction of a Deus Ex Machina character at the 11th hour all describe Pizzeria Simulator to a T. Except the difference is that security breach's flaws were the fault of Scott's bad communication with Steel Wool, and we're getting a whole game to retroactively explain the book originating plot elements. Moreover, these elements don't overwrite previously established concepts and characterization. Looking back on it now, the more I realize how terrible of an ending Pizzeria Simulator would have been to the entire series. Without security breach as a scapegoat, this would have been the final impression people had of FNaF. A weird, incogent story that constantly chases its tail and backpedals on its own finality. I just can't with the utter lack of creativity people have. FNaF has so much franchise potential, and it's capitalized on that. Why should the story end with this mediocre and underwhelming finale dressed up to look like a good conclusion to the plot when there's so much story to explore? So many concepts and locations and characters we can dive deeper into. We as a community need to stop fixating on Pizzeria Simulator and propping it up as this perfect finale. Now, with Secret of the Mimic right around the corner, we as a community need to stop dwelling on the past and look forward to this exciting new era of FNaF. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm preparing for a lot of discourse regarding this one because I know it's a fairly contentious take, but I invite it. Admittedly, I did choose the most uncharitable interpretations of the writing for a lot of my takes here, so if you have a way that you see things that makes the story click into place more neatly that I didn't see, please go off in the comments, I'd love to hear. Also, of course, I'm not trying to roast any Pizzeria Simulator fans out there. I don't really like making videos being mean like this, because I think there's so much negativity online as it is. But the amount of stupid discourse I've seen from people who clearly aren't actively engaged with FNaF anymore in response to Secret of the Mimic has reached a boiling point, and I figured the best way to push back would be to fight fire with fire. That being said, if you love Pizzeria Simulator, my impression being that many do, then that's great. I'm glad you were able to appreciate something I couldn't, and I don't want to take that away from you. Hi, so this is May talking right before I'm about to post this video, and I've decided to change my plans regarding what I'm going to do next. My next video is another being mean / critical one, which, like I said, I don't really like doing, but this one was genuinely taxing on my mental health, so I've decided I'm going to put that on pause for now. So with that said, I'm not entirely sure what my plan is for my next project. I might do something Deltarune related, since chapters 3 and 4 are right around the corner, and it's been making its way back into my brain like a parasite. And with Secret of the Mimic right around the corner, which could be a major status quo changer, I'm hesitant to start writing anything about writing yet, but that is also true of Deltarune, so I might just dip my toes into some random miscellaneous topic for the time being. So, on that ominous note, I once again want to thank you for watching. If you've watched this far, I'm glad my inane ramblings mean something to someone. I'd deeply appreciate it if you left a like, comment, or maybe even subscribed if you're feeling frisky. But with all that being said, I love you all, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!